My name is Miriam Gedwiser. I am on the faculty here at Drisha in the summer and during the year. This week's Parsha is Lech Lecha, which begins the story of Avraham Avinu, and more broadly the story of the patriarchs in general. We're actually introduced to Avraham last week, or at this point Avram, in the genealogy at the end of Parashat Noach, but there was no indication at that point what Avram's place in the Torah would be. Now we're introduced to Avram's special role, somewhat abruptly. God tells Avram, get up and go, Lech Lecha, from his land, his birthplace, his father's house, to the unspecified land God will show him, and accompanies that command with a promise of blessing. Avram takes his household and begins to travel, reaching the land of Canaan and traveling southward before a famine forces him to keep going through Canaan to Egypt. As Avram approaches Egypt, we hear his voice for the first time in the biblical text, saying to his wife, pretend to be my sister so we can avoid problems in Egypt. Paro takes Sarai, his wife, is punished, meaning Avram's wife. Paro is punished, and Paro sends her and Avram out with great wealth. When they return to Canaan, Avram returns to the site of an altar that he had built previously when he arrived. And we hear Avram's voice then for the second time, when, after a fight between his shepherds and the shepherds of his nephew Lot, he suggests that the two part ways. Lot chooses to settle near Sodom, a prosperous city of wicked people. God appears to Avram again, promising him the land and multitudes of descendants to possess it, and Avram builds another altar. We then have the episode of the War of the Four Kings against the Fives, in which Avram defeats the victors, who have taken his nephew Lot captive. The king of Sodom asked Avram to return the human spoils of war, the king's former subjects, but not the booty. We hear Avram's voice for the third time when he refuses to take any of the spoils, other than to defray the cost of his battle companions, lest the king say that he made Avram rich. After these things, God speaks to Avram in a machazeh, some sort of a vision, a word that appears here for the first time in the Torah. What's the message? Al tira Avram, anochi magen lech, scharcha harbe me'od. Do not fear, Avram. I am your shield. Your reward is very great. But for this reassurance, we would have had no idea that Avram was in fact afraid, and commentators have long struggled with this passage, how to parse it, and how it fits in the narrative. Even more surprising, in response to this spontaneous reassurance, we hear Avram's voice speaking to God for the first time, asking the following: Hashem Elokim, ma titain li, v'anochi holech ariri, uven meshek beiti, hu demesek Eliezer. God, what can you give me? For I go, or perhaps go to my death, childless, and all I have is my steward Eliezer. Until now, as Robert also phrases it, all of Avram's responses to God have been silent obedience. The first time Avram speaks to God is to express a doubt. This question doesn't get answered. No answer. Avram speaks again. Hey, Lila Nantata Zara, maybe you didn't get it. You haven't given me any children. V'hinei ben beiti yureshuti. My servant is going to inherit me. Now God responds, this one will not inherit you, but you will have a literal biological descendant, asher yitzei mimeacha. God takes Avram outside and shows him the stars, and soon continues on to another promise that Avram will inherit the land, at which point Avram asks another question, which may be translated either as, how will I know that I will inherit it, or by what means will I inherit it? At which point God introduces the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant between the pieces. Against this background, I want to focus in particular on the machazeh, this vision that occurs after the War of the Kings. Radak comments that God told Avram more in the machazeh than in previous messages, because this prophecy included not only words but actions, such as going outside, counting the stars, and the covenant of the pieces. But Levi Yitzchak Miberditchev, the Kedushas Levi, has a different take on the nature of this machazeh, focusing not on what comes after, but what comes before. He notes that until this point in the story, Avram had served God out of ahava, out of love, alone. However, after the War of the Kings, when Avram killed the four kings and took vengeance on God's enemies, he also entered madrigat gvura v'fachad, the level of heroism or greatness and fear. After that war, Avram reached the level of machazeh, a vision where he could see, as it were, more. It seems unlikely that this is the first time that Avram had a scary experience in the fulfillment of his divine mission. Right? For example, he has already abandoned his home for a new and unspecified land, and then been forced down to Egypt in a famine, had his wife abducted. The war is, however, the first time that we see Avram take an action not commanded by God explicitly or by brute necessity. Rather, Avram puts his general values into play to act proactively here without a command, come to the aid of captured people, among them his nephew. The Kedushas Levi's approach, that the proactive and probably voluntary war against evil brought Avram to a higher level of serving God, is fascinating. But also difficult in the biblical context, because it's precisely as he achieves this higher level that we hear Avram speak to God for the first time, and what he has is a question, an expression of doubt. What can or will you give me? I'm childless. The Kedushas Levi doesn't articulate this question, but the continuation of his comment offers a fascinating solution. He distinguishes those who can see, as it were, God by arriving at an intellectual knowledge of the Creator, from those who do mitzvot and therefore receive what he calls siyata dishmaya, divine assistance, in order to serve God. Only the former can influence others. Only those who see come to some sort of intellectual knowledge. Until now, Avram was among the latter, serving God by following God's command and receiving divine help. But after this war, Avram achieves the former status, where he can see God intellectually and therefore pass on that knowledge. And it's therefore now that Avram is for the first time explicitly promised a descendant, figuratively the ability to propagate what he stands for in the world. If we situate this approach back in the biblical narrative, what we have is a higher level of divine knowledge inspired by the willingness to take voluntary risks for the sake of God, family, and justice, that in turn inspires a different level of relationship with God. One that admits questioning and produces, if we return to Radak, not just verbal messages but actions as well. As Avram's descendants, we can only aspire to be worthy of this legacy. Shabbat Shalom.